Hello and welcome to the Systems Thinking webinar series sponsored by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology System Design and Management Program. My name is Lois Slavin. I'm the host for this meeting, and it gives me a great pleasure to introduce to you one of our earliest alums, Burl Amsbury. Burl will be speaking today on Cultivating Resilience with Heuristics and Systems Thinking Lessons from New Industries. Before he starts, I'd like to just remind you that we will be sending out a link to the recording and the slides in about a week, and we will also be having a Q&A at the conclusion of Burl's presentation. If you have any questions, please type them directly into the chat section and address them to everyone. They will be read after Burl finishes his presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to hand this over to Burl.
You know, I've always felt that MIT needed more cowboys, so I'm here to have an impact. I will leave the details of that slide to you to read in your leisure, but I'll skip to where I am now, which is business coaching and consulting for food and agriculture, and I'm making my way into the functional medicine world as well, not as a practitioner, as a consultant, business consultant. And I also have a managing member of a grass-fed organic cattle company, and we have big ideas for scaling that up in a sustainable way. So the big message, one of the main messages that I'd like to deliver today is that systems thinking is really a natural human endeavor. It's a natural consequence, unfortunately though, often of the painful results of linear or short-term thinking. But because it is natural, we see it pop up. If we pay attention, we can see it in a number of different places through history and in various niches even today. And so I'm going to showcase a couple of those niches. One of them is, both are near and dear to me. One is regenerative ranching, and I know we all know what ranching is. It's regenerative because it improves ecological health metrics mostly conventional ranching tends to deplete these ideas or these measures. Functional medicine is the second one, and why we understand medicine, but why functional? Because it seeks to optimize functionality or vitality rather than targeting the mere absence of disease. And I'm going to show you a little bit more about both of those here shortly, but let's look at some commonalities. And the first one, the one that fascinates me the most, is the simple fact that the strongest predictor of success in both cases is a healthy microbiome. You know, in one case it's the soil microbiome, and in another it's a gut microbiome. But bacteria are a big deal, and they're only now, I think, science is beginning to understand more and more about those, but they've largely been not so much on our radar screen as managers of those two systems. Some other commonalities, they're both small, fast growth niches in large, troubled industries, and I should say relatively small. I know more about the grass-fed beef industry, and it's only relatively small. It's still $1 billion industry growing at, depending on who you believe, somewhere between 20 and 30%, so it's real business. Another one is that almost by definition, quick fixes don't work. Short-term thinking simply isn't compatible with systems thinking. Another, and largely because of that last one, another one is that, you know, we're asking practitioners in these two niches to change the way they think about their work, and really in some ways change the way they think about their professional identity. So change leadership is a big deal. It's a key important of progressing in these two industries. And this graphic I've got up here is Glacier's formula. If you're not familiar with Glacier's formula, it's worth a closer look. I'll give you a brief dive. Essentially what it says is that we all have some natural resistance to change to some degree, and in order to overcome that change, three things need to be true. All three things need to be true. One is dissatisfaction with the status quo needs to be strong. And really it's more accurate, I think, to say that our awareness of our dissatisfaction with the status quo needs to be strong, because people can get used to anything. I think we've all seen examples of that. Another thing that has to be true is that we need a clear, strong vision for what could be true. And then third, we need to have clear first steps outlined for us or for ourselves. If all three of those things are true, then we have some hope of overcoming resistance. So, change leadership. And speaking of change leadership, the second fun fact about common to both of these niches is that leadership is dominated by women. So, in short, these two niches are all about bacteria and women, which I find fascinating. And that domination, by the way, it's not subtle. It's about, in all the different ways I've sliced and diced my anecdotal data, so I'd say I've got about 60 data points. Between 2/3 and 3/4 of the players are women. Okay, so I've said regenerative ranching is systems thinking. I haven't proven it to you yet, and I'm about to show you their principles, the principles that they talk to each other about and the way they talk about their work. I have done some mild paraphrasing. That's just so that we all on this call have some common language to understand it, but this is their language for the most part. So first and foremost, it's interactions amongst what we would call agents or elements of the system and its environment that determine systemic behavior. It's very different than saying that an outside manager, by looking at one piece of the puzzle, can manage the outcome. Another thing is simple observation that Mother Nature, it's hard to think of anything more sustainable pretty much by definition than Mother Nature. And nature it's sustainable because it's complex. There's really I don't think there's any such thing as a sustainable, simple system. So that says we need to pay attention, embrace complexity, and pay attention to nature and how it works, mimic it and learn from it, and have that be an ongoing process. It's perhaps a little bit more specific, but not too hard to extrapolate this one. The difference between beneficial and harmful animal impact on a piece of land or soil ecology depends more on timing than almost anything else. So think about cyclic, intense pulsing of cattle or some other kind of livestock on a piece of land, rather than chronic low-level presence, which is what you typically see when you drive through the countryside. And the reason for this really boils down to the fact that complex systems often contain delays, and so that delay piece translates into the need for management timing. Metrics for success should be chosen wisely. They talk a lot about holistic metrics, and I would say that in general their argument is for considering context. And so by that I mean community considerations, what's going on with your neighbors, what impact you're going to have on your neighbors when you make this decision or that decision, what about the larger community. Of course there are market drivers and market considerations. There are a whole host of things besides the simple matter of moving cattle or managing a piece of land, and they're big on understanding where those boundaries are and where your system, how much ground, so to speak, your system really covers. Embrace human creativity. There's a lot of talk out there and a lot of literature out there these days about engagement, employee engagement, and how important that is. Well, I think what that really boils down to is that if anybody's going to be engaged, they're something of themselves has to be recognized and appreciated. So we need to leave room for people to bring their own human creativity to the table and become part of the system, not just try to manage it or be part of a management protocol, but actually become part of it. Whether that system is a piece of land or an organization or a process, but people need room to do that. And so you need to leave room as leaders and managers in these organizations to have people do things differently than you might. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how to sort of ride the fence between making sure we don't over control, but at the same time making sure we don't let things go haywire all by themselves, which can also happen. Database decisions whenever possible. Intuition, of course, is helpful at times, but it can be tricky. You have to watch out for that. And so database decision making whenever possible, certainly not always possible. So the second choice is to measure the outcome of those of those decisions so that you can make database decisions in the future. And how do you measure the outcome of those decisions? Well, with the wisely chosen metrics that you have already thought through and decided upon. Okay, let's do the same thing for functional medicine here real quickly. And you'll see, I think, that there is a little bit of overlap. So for example, they talk about evidence-based medicine, so database decision making. They de-emphasize intuition, and they also de-emphasize something that they call something else, which I had in my notes and now I don't have it. But it's very complex phraseology that I can't even remember. And I'm only about 80% sure I know what it means. I think it means reductionist logic. So I'll just tell you what I mean by reductionist logic. If in a laboratory we know that A causes B, and in a laboratory we know that B causes C, we often find ourselves assuming that out in the real world A leads to C. And it turns out when we're dealing with complex systems, of course, that's not always true. In fact, it's not even a good bet. Because there are multiple causal relationships that may not have been accounted for in that laboratory setting. And in fact, I have some interesting stories about soil and some of the beliefs we have about soil health that have led to a whole industry around synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and stuff like that that really are. They end up putting us in a kind of an addictive loop of land management. They also know that small differences in elements of a system and the environment of that system and the treatment of that system over time can lead to large divergent systemic behaviors. So that means that two patients with similar symptoms might have very different root causes. And it also means the reverse can also be true. So two patients with very similar root cause issues can have very different symptoms. So in other words, understand the system right here in front of you, the one you're trying to treat, understand that system to understand the symptoms. And speaking of root causes, of course, understanding and digging for root causes is good practice, but don't be fooled. Root causes themselves are often an interaction amongst various agents and environmental conditions in the system itself. So nature versus nurture sort of misses the point. Never mind that. Okay, so human substance system, functional medicine talks about 7 systems in the human body. They don't talk a whole lot about the individual organs, other than that individual organs tend to show up in the symptomatic story that patients tell and the doctors need to understand. All right, functional medicine has the 7 subsystems. They call them systems, we would call them subsystems. They're all interconnected, and I refer to that whole thing as a causal mess. I don't think they call it that. Again, choose metrics wisely And in this case, in consultation with the patient or the system itself, which is kind of an interesting twist. Okay, so that's pretty clearly a couple of niches that engage in systems thinking, but they don't call it that for the most part, which I find interesting. So this stuff has just, it's arisen, and I'm going to, so regenerative ranching talks about holistic management, and it's my belief, I've dug into this quite a bit, and it's my belief that ultimately the reason for the need for systems thinking in ranching is that our conventional food system has used calories as a metric for success, and it has led to some serious unintended consequences. So calories as a metric for success in production or agriculture is another way of just saying yield, how many bushels per acre or whatever. That has led to a breakdown of waste management. So we have pollution, we have sort of, again, that addictive loop regarding synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, etc. Using calories as a measure of food success in our personal diets, hopefully we're all starting to realize that's problematic. Not all calories are created equal. So poor metric, ultimately, either implicit or explicit, has led to serious problems. And as a result, there's pushback from the consumer level, really, that has led to regenerative ranching, sustainable agriculture in general, and a whole new burgeoning food system. Functional medicine or integrative medicine arose for a similar reason. Lifespan as a metric for success is poor. And in fact, the United States is on a list of the just under 200 countries in the world. We're number 34 in terms of lifespan. So we're not even in the top 15%. But of course, cost per capita, we are number one, and we're number one not by a little bit, but by 35% more than number two. Number two on that list is Switzerland, and all the other northern European countries, just interestingly enough, are right clustered around there. But Switzerland is also number two in terms of lifespan. So there's something about that, again, mostly implicit, sometimes explicit measure of success in healthcare is not working, and it's not even working in terms of lifespan. History, believe it or not, has a systems thinking niche. It's called big history, and I'm far from an expert on either one of those, but I have some interest, and it's on my list. I'll tell you that one of the only history professors I ever really listened to, Rufus Fears, says that the first lesson of history is that we don't learn from it. So perhaps that's what gave rise really to big history. What it is essentially it's just the bigger picture. It puts our history in a much larger context. It looks for patterns and themes. It acknowledges that our history is subjective, and it also embraces a different kind of delivery. So it's not just books that you have to curl up in a corner and read and try to understand, but it's multimedia and it's online and it's free. I recommend a Google search for big history. It's pretty cool. Military aviation, something I know something about, has what we call the OODA loop, which is an acronym that stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. It arose in the Korean War really because the other folks had better equipment and we needed to have better pilots. So it's sort of part of the training that still exists today. That Orient piece, the second O, is what we might call the mental model, or mental model of what's happening. So the OODA loop is about having a very agile mental model and getting to decision and therefore getting to action much quicker than the other guy. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the OODA loop, but the bottom line is that these things all came up, all these different new inventions of systems thinking came because they had to, because either something was wrong with the way we were managing the big picture. And it's what works. Systems thinking is what works. So as leaders in systems thinking, as leaders in organizations of any kind that are entrepreneurial and trying to get better, the question then becomes, well, how do we get out in front of this thing? How do we skip the part where we have, all these painful unintended consequences and just get to the point? So how do we bake it into our worlds professionally? And I've got several ideas for that. Some of them we've kind of touched on, and some of them might be a little bit new. I bet none of them are brand new to any of you, but it's worth taking a look. So first of all, tragedy of the commons. That is probably the most common outcome of linear or short-term thinking. Shared resources, properly cared for, reward good behavior in the medium to long term, but by definition, really not in the short term. So that's how the tragedy of the commons happens. So what do we do about it? Well, identify your shared resources and contribute to their improvement. If you're engaged in cost accounting, shared natural resources, or they don't necessarily have to be natural resources, but often they aren't on your balance sheet. But as managers, and if you think about management accounting, they probably ought to be on your balance sheet, on your management accounting version. And when they appear there, then it starts to make sense to make investments in their maintenance and upkeep and improvement. So here's some examples of shared resources that you might find. Soil microbiome is, of course, something we've sort of touched on here already. Internet bandwidth, mutual trust under any situation is mutual trust, insurance pools. You get the idea. We've talked about metrics and what impact poorly chosen metrics can have. And here I'm talking about good metrics, and I really mean holistic metrics when I say that. Now, the problem we run into with good holistic metrics is that they're often hard to quantify and articulate. So what happens often is that we fall back on something easier to explain and easier to quantify and measure. So we end up with lifespan instead of health span. We end up with NPK, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and the relative and absolute contents of those elements in soil as a measure of soil health, and that completely misses the living ecology in soil. There's calories instead of nutrition. There's our gross national product instead of Bhutan's gross national happiness. I don't know for sure, but I bet it's not a complete accident that Bhutan is the only carbon negative country in the world. So in my opinion, it's better to get a good holistic metric and let it be hard to measure. Get it mostly right, let it evolve, rather than kind of a reductionist, half-blind metric, but get it 100% measurable. It's likely to work for a while, but of course we know what happens. We know what happens when there's something that we're not seeing. So we need to understand the larger system. And that may be obvious, but when was the last time you really took a step back metaphorically from your organization or your process or your system and just stared at it for a while? Not try to manage it, but just watched it, got curious about it, looked for the causal loops, looked for the multiple reasons. This is really a form of meditation. And if you think about it that way, it can be quite a useful tool. We see more and more about how meditation is a useful leadership tool, and this is a great way to do that. I think it has value on multiple axes. Here's that OODA loop again. The big thing that I haven't already talked about regarding OODA loop that comes to mind for me when I think about this, and again, the OODA loop is essentially about keeping an agile mental model and letting that inform quick decisions, quick actions, and the next update to your mental model. What comes to mind for me is manage by nudging. So what I mean by that is whatever system we're talking about that you're in charge of, it has to want to go in the direction you want it to go in, really. It kind of has to want to move in that direction, or at least be neutral and be easy to nudge. Because otherwise you're forced to be in it as opposed to be objectively managing it. So you have to be in it, and you have to be efforting all the time. And that's not sustainable. So to build a lasting organization, you need to build hire the right people, build the right processes, have the right incentives in place, and have the practice of stepping back and watching, because whatever it is you think you built isn't quite what you built. That's always true. So step back and watch. Einstein said this one way, I'm going to say it another way, which is operationalize your process for understanding a system before you operationalize your process for managing it. So that comes in when you're training somebody new, training a new hire, or when you have an organization already in place, your staff isn't new, but you're looking at a new problem or a new spin on whatever it is you've already done in the past. The important thing is how you go about understanding the system more than how you go about doing it and managing it later. All right. How many times have you heard somebody say sustainable when what they really meant was stable? I think it happens a lot, and if you start to notice, I bet you'll notice as well. Stability is not stable, and the reason is that if you build something stable, the context for whatever it is you built changes, and so it's no longer appropriate anymore. So it doesn't last forever. People who focus on stability rather than sustainability end up building unsustainable stability. One of the ways that context can change is with industry life cycles. So I'll give you an example with grass-fed beef. We know that the grass-fed beef industry is right around the beginning of that introduction stage of life cycle growth, industry growth. And we know as we climb that curve, we know a few things are going to happen. One is the profit margins, which are pretty favorable right now, they're going to shrink. Seller's power will diminish. And the reason for those two things is that right now the landscape is dotted with small operations making a pretty good margin, but they don't have a lot of economies of scale, and they are delivering unreliable quality. And that's just not going to last. Right now that's doable because demand is stronger than supply. But again, we're going to climb that growth curve. People are going to grow their operations and build economies of scale. As a result, profit margins will come down. So you're going to have to be at scale to compete, and consumers are going to start getting more of what they want, which is quality and taste and reliability. And all that in the face of a 3-year production cycle. So that stuff starts now. And whatever your industry is going to have a different details, of course, but understanding that life cycle, paying specific attention, and it's not rocket science, it's easy to do, but go out and find out where the industry is bound to be going next, and pay attention to where you need to be in 5 or 10 years and start working on it right now. But industry life cycles aren't the only source of contextual change. Another one is stuff we can't see coming. It's just stuff we don't know. We don't know what we don't know. So if we don't know it, how do we remain resilient to it? How do we create sustainability in the face of something we don't know is going to happen? Well, in a word, the answer is relationships. Identify other people out there who share your values and your shared resources, and develop and nurture those relationships. These are your tribe. You're all going to be in the same boat when something happens that you can't predict. All right, so if sustainability is not stability, then what is it? Well, it's two things: resilience and adaptivity. I might have made that word up, adaptivity, but you know what I mean. By the way, that willow tree there in the image is what I think of when I think of resilience. So willow tree branches blow in the wind changes direction, they blow the other way. If the wind stops, they hang down. The willow tree is happy no matter what. That's resilience. Now, three things make up resilience. One of them is diversity. So all kinds of diversity, people, ideas, endeavors. And the quick follow-on from diversity is don't hire in your own image. It's tempting because it's most comfortable, but it's problematic in the long term. Now, do hire from your own tribe, though. Shared values and resources. Modularity, I think we probably all understand that pretty well. When I think of modularity at an organization level, I call it Goldilocks connectivity, not too independent, not too interdependent. I think about decentralization. I think about, decentralization can be either geographic or conceptual. I think about business units or franchises. There's redundancy. I know I need to explain that one even less, but I put it up here because I like to talk about flirts. So there's a flock of sheep, and they need a certain amount of land to operate, and there's a herd of cattle, and they need a certain amount of land to operate. If you put those two entities together, they need less land than the two separate entities need together in sum. So it uses less land to create a flirt. That's a perfect example of advantageous redundancy. And of course, cross-training of personnel is another example of that. Okay, adaptivity. So that image is a tree that has been exposed to strong unidirectional wind over time and has grown to kind of accommodate that, the presence of that wind all the time. So both adaptivity and resilience are really, in this metaphor, are both responses to wind. But the wind in question is happening and moving and changing at different frequencies. So with high frequency changes in that wind, we want to be resilient and just move with it. That's resilience. If the wind is sort of ever-present, strong, and unidirectional, we need to adapt to it so that becomes our neutral default operation. And that's why we need both resilience and adaptivity. We need to operate under the conditions. We're always going to be under two different kinds of forces, high frequency and low frequency. So you need to accommodate both of those. Now, one way to do that is to build a learning organization. I can't hold a candle to Peter Singe's work in that area, so I won't try to, but you're all familiar with it, or if you're not, I suggest you get familiar with it. It's good work. Learning organization. Another thing is question your paradigms, and this can be uncomfortable. So it can take courage. And an example I've used not too long ago, last few months, I was with a co-op of cattle ranchers, grass-fed beef cattle ranchers, and the paradigms I had them question were things like, well, are you sure about grass-fed? And are you sure beef? Because we have other options and consumers aren't necessarily sure. Now the answer was yes in both cases, but it's good to know that. It's good to just go ahead, square up to those difficult questions, make sure, and then move on. And do that every so often, because the answer might change after a while. These are really a couple of tools. I put them on one slide, and they're in support of questioning paradigms. The first one is, I like to say that all interesting questions really have the same first answer, which is, well, it depends. And so really your job as leaders is to figure out what it depends on. So if you think about, just about any time you have two relatively reasonable parties hardening up around positions and disagreeing with each other, in a lively manner, probably the real answer is, well, it depends. And so what does it depend on? When is the entity A correct and when is entity B correct? And let's figure that out and accommodate both, because we need to deal with both. So it depends. Get that into your vocabulary. And of course, we're all familiar, I think, probably with the tyranny of the or, which is Jim Collins' work. Avoiding that. Now, I bring that up because I want to tell you two things. One, I find that the most insidious source of the tyranny of the or is the voices in my own head. So I'm learning to be more careful about the questions I ask myself or pose for myself to think about. The other is sometimes I think we have a tendency to think we escaped the or when we really didn't. And here's what I mean. I was asked not too long ago by somebody, in all seriousness, do I want to be sustainable or do I want to be profitable? Well, of course, my answer was both. But the way they interpreted that was, oh, so you're going to make a trade-off. So you're going to be a little bit profitable and a little bit sustainable. And that's not what I meant, but it's what the person heard. And sometimes we can get confused about the difference. That's still an or. A trade-off is still an or. The key is that in that case, the trade-off is between sustainability and medium to long-term profit. Now, sustainability and short-term profit really aren't compatible. And that does have to become a trade-off. That is, I believe, an or question. But the trick to get to that and is to think about, reframe the question and figure out how you move those two choices off the same axis. They're not the same. But you can be trapped into thinking they are if you're not careful. Okay, so that's all I've got to say, and I'm going to open it up to questions here. And that's my email in case anybody wants to follow up later with questions. I'll be happy to field those. Lois, what do you got?
Wow, I've got a lot here. First of all, thank you, Burl, and I think you have created a lot of interest in discussing the philosophy and the practice of systems thinking. Most of what we've received today are comments, so I'm going to read a few at a time and then ask you to weigh in on what people are commenting on. So we have from Chris Bouch, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who asks, is there a contradiction between embracing human creativity and being cautious about intuition? And then Christina Bowens chimed in, maybe we need a cautious embrace. And somebody wrote, George Palaska said, I'm not sure whether you can really separate these, since intuition tells you whether your creative idea might have a chance to work. And Christina chimes back in and says, it allows you to identify potential solutions, but if you rely on intuition too much, you may miss a better solution. Thus, the database support is necessary where available.
Okay, so I think my first response to that, my first thought is yes, yes, and yes, and yes. You know, wisdom. So again, this is in many ways really a leadership talk. And wisdom, the practice of wisdom, it relies on several things, but one of the things it relies on is an appreciation of nuance, I believe. So there isn't an answer here. It's, you know, again, the answer is, well, it depends. Part of leadership is teasing apart all these valid counter arguments for doing one thing or another. If you find yourself looking for a sweeping, always true or 95% true answer that you can just run with and use all the time, then you're not really squaring up to an interesting question. It's good to be able to operationalize if the issue at hand lends itself to that. But when we're talking about human beings and getting their engagement and talking about embracing their human creativity, it's not, there's no single answer. I think what's important is to realize that, first of all, for all kinds of reasons, I believe it's important to have full engagement and to leave room for other people to bring something themselves to the table. And if what they're bringing to the table isn't useful, and there's a pattern of not usefulness, well, it's probably a bad hire. That's a different conversation. But at the same time, sure. I mean, you can't have chaos in the laboratory where people are just doing whatever experiment they want to. There has to be some direction, and again, direction is part of leadership too. So I think just being aware of the trade-offs there and making decisions and being comfortable with the fact that you're going to get it wrong sometimes, that's what's important. Just expanding the shades of gray and the palette from which you choose. Does that help?
I think it does. They can't answer except by typing into the chat. But I suspect it does help quite a bit. Delphin Rabinovich commented something that I believe supplements or reinforces what you were saying. Hold on just a second. I need to scroll back up because the comments and questions are coming in so quickly that it keeps refreshing my screen.
Well, just choose the nice ones.
The nice ones. They're all nice. They're all pithy as well. Creativity, Delphin says, creativity is the source of ideas. Choosing between ideas needs systemic analysis using database support. And he cautions, do not use intuition to choose among those ideas.
Okay, so he's saying pay attention to creativity and make database decisions whenever possible. So certainly can't argue with that.
No. Notice the and, folks. Okay, my screen just refreshed. While I'm finding my place again, I just want to remind those of you who are asking that you will receive a link to the recording and the slides within about a week. So yes, you will be able to check in and review what you've heard, and you will also be able to contact Burl directly if you'd like, because we will be including his contact info. Let's see, some of you were writing some long tomes here, which are very interesting, but I'm going to cull what I believe is the nugget in some of these queries. Jim O'Rourke asks, what's the balance of systemic decision making and the free will of innovation? And he comments, I guess it's the risk assessment of how much risk I'm willing to take on based on the decision. But sometimes you don't know about that when things are on the drawing board. Can you comment?
Well, I think to a large degree it looks like you've answered your own question. I mean, if we were in a conversation face to face, the first thing I would do is, okay, well, give me an example and what are you trying to do and what does success look like? Because you know, the reason some of this stuff is, it's hard to generalize sometimes with these things, because to my earlier point, it's case by case, and you have to bring your answer for this situation might be different than your answer for that situation. That's kind of the point. We're talking about different systems or different situations.
This is an actual question rather than a comment. Have you explored these areas you've discussed in the context of various system archetypes?
If I know what you mean, then the answer is no.
Somebody asked about design thinking, which it not only involves a lot of customer research to understand the problem, but then is paired to rapid prototyping to make sure you're actually solving the problem. How does that design thinking fit into the systems thinking approach that you're advocating here?
I would say that fits right into, you know, it's Einstein quote, it's spend 55 minutes understanding the problem and 5 minutes solving it.
Somebody writes, the title for this talk is Cultivating Resilience. I apologize if I missed it, but you discussed sustainable equals resilience plus adaptivity. Is the message that systems thinking principles should be applied to resilience and that leads to sustainability?
Maybe the title should have been Cultivating Sustainability. I think you might be reading too more than I meant for you to read into that. It's, titles often get invented before the details of the talk, and so as things evolved, we've got, go with my slide, not the title.
From David Bode said, just an observation, are the same considerations applicable to renewal of complex technology-based systems such as urban mobility, the electric grid? Is there work going on in these areas to your knowledge?
I'm sure there is. I'm not in it myself, and so I don't know a whole lot about that, but I'm certain that some of these concepts apply.
Okay, from Sylvie Bachschorn, is there some research about why women are good in systems thinking, if they indeed are?
Well, first of all, I don't know, and I'm not surprised somebody asked that. I didn't say they were good at it. I just said there are lots of them, but I imagine they are. So I really don't know. I don't know what the data says, and I really don't have an opinion. It's just an observation I find interesting. I'm glad to see it.
Mm-hmm. For those of you who are willing to do a little bit of internet research, if you Google Sheila Widnall, Widnall, she is an institute professor here at MIT, and she has posted a copy of I believe it was a keynote or presentation or a speech she made about 15 years ago on why women are good at leadership in a way that it's different than men. And my understanding of the premise is that it is because they are able to think more holistically. So check that out on the internet if you're interested. Here's one here from George Lordos. Do you regularly create complex systems dynamic models for your work? And if yes, have you ever had big insights which were made possible by investing in a lot of effort in a model? Or have the benefits come from awareness of systems thinking in general? P.S. I graduated with an MBA from Sloan in 2000, so maybe we took some classes together.
That's a really good question. And for me personally, the answer is it's more a matter of awareness of systems thinking in general. I'm trying to think. I have built models, and I think sometimes the process of building a model is helpful in sort of developing my for lack of a better term, my intuition about how a system works. But what I carry around in my head is not a model. I don't generally create models from which to create, detailed quantitative solutions. I use them to develop intuition and then move on.
Question from Kyle Hansen: Have you seen successful applications of these approaches to holistic forest restoration? Seems like there is a large opportunity for this to fundamentally change the effectiveness of forest management.
Yes, I have seen that. I don't know a whole lot about it, so I won't have much to say, but it's out there.
From George Pulaski: Systems thinking and critical systems heuristics rely heavily on feedback, knowing the boundaries of your system, identifying and defining causal connections, etc. Are you assuming that everyone here is familiar with these concepts? If so, what are exactly the lessons learned from new industries? I have the feeling that I missed the red line in your presentation.
I think the red line was the last several slides where I talked about heuristics that I believe apply to other industries, systems thinking principles that apply. You don't have to be a systems thinker. I was making some assumptions about the audience, but you don't really need to be a systems thinker to absorb what I was talking about in the last 10 slides or so.
This is from Amian Das. Comprehension of a problem and then working towards a solution for it is the usual approach. The innovative approach is to know a problem, but think and work on brand new solutions that have not been worked on before. Classic example is the commercial production of cars. In the early 1900s, if you asked people what they wanted for better transportation, they probably would have said a faster horse. But companies like Ford looked beyond customer wishes and went beyond in terms of innovations that completely revolutionized transportation. Mm-hmm. And the family car became a reality.
Yeah, questioning paradigms. And sometimes incremental change just doesn't work. Sometimes you have to take a big leap because incremental change just gets corrected back to some local optimum, a faster horse.
Okay.
Leaving room for big leaps like that is a big deal. And making a practice is a purposeful practice of checking yourself and questioning paradigms.
From Ashish Shrivastava, can you throw some more light on what you meant by management by nudging?
Well, I'll give you a metaphorical answer, and then I'll try to give you something a little bit more down to earth with managing people. But when it comes time to manage, so with the cattle business, we move cattle a fair amount, and sometimes we need them to move through chutes or gates or something, and there's a whole bunch of them, and we got a lot to do that day, and we just need them to move. So one of the tricks that can happen, and this is actually something that holds true for a lot of animal management, which is you can hurry a steer along in the direction it's pointed if you grab its tail in a certain way. You don't hurt the animal, but you just grab its tail in a certain way, and it's weird, and they sort of move away from it. So they move away from it. The trick, the management by nudging, is to let go the very instant that they're moving in the direction you want them to move. So you're not pushing them and bothering them and doing anything that disturbs them in any way if they're doing what you already want them to do. Animals, and I think human beings, because we're animals, we learn by the absence of pressure. So you can use pressure and the release of pressure to manage animals a lot better and a lot more, it's a lot nicer for everybody. So if you bring that to, human management or leadership, I'm talking about using pressure judiciously and only when necessary, and for the most part use positive reinforcement. And these aren't new concepts, none of this stuff really is. But systems thinking helps us understand why it works. So with leadership, I think if and there are all kinds of tools for putting pressure on people, whether it's physical presence, whether it's promotion, whether it's pay, whether it's rewards or the absence of rewards, whether it's, actual threats. Not a fan of those, but I know people use them. So those need to be used judiciously, and the most comfortable thing is when somebody's doing what you want them to do, and they're moving forward in their career, they're advancing the cause, they're helping the company. Let them do that. Give them more space.
Great. I know some of you need to leave at 1. I think Bert might have another 5 minutes or so for one more question. Is that
Sure.
accurate? Okay. Before the rest of you leave, I just wanted to let you know about the May 9th webinar. Those of you from Sloan may know or remember Professor Steve Spear. He's a guru on innovation, and he will be speaking on competing at innovative speed. Why is it so darn hard? In the follow-up email to this webinar, you will get a link to registration and more details for Steve Spear's webinar, and we hope you'll be able to join us. Again, the link to the webinar and slides for today will be sent to you within about a week. Now, our last question from David Otenga. Thank you very much for the talk. You mentioned the frequency of variation as a key factor influencing the desirability of resilience versus adaptivity. Do you think there are other factors influencing their respective desirability, and to what extent do you think they also include setup, culture, and other characteristics, capabilities of the team or organization operating in the system/environment, as well as the external characteristics and dynamics of the system and environment?
That's a pretty wide-ranging question there. I would say that one point of clarification maybe for me is to say that what's the difference between high frequency and low frequency change when it comes to external forces like wind or metaphorical wind. And of course the answer is, well, it's all relative to the speed at which, the frequency at which it's kind of the natural resonance frequency of your system or organization. If it's perfectly natural for the system to move at high frequency, then then resilience is going to tend to be more appropriate. It's all relative.
Thank you, Burl, and thank you to all who attended, and thank you to all who posted such pithy and thought-provoking questions and comments. This was really wonderful. Hope to see you at the May 9th webinar with Steve Spear, and have a great day, everyone.